Okay, my name is Howard Eber, and I am an alcoholic. We have been spending a lot of time talking about the problem. We read through the doctor's opinion where we were given the diagnosis. We were given the facts of what it is to be an alcoholic, that we have this threefold condition made up of a physical allergy that triggers a craving every time we put the chemical into our system. And we put it into our system because we have a mental obsession that overcomes all thoughts to the contrary. And we have a problem with that mental obsession, and we run into that mental obsession because we have at its core, a spiritual malady. We are restless and irritable and discontented, and that's in the good moments. And we eventually convince ourselves that the relative ease, the sense, not even real sense of ease and comfort that'll come from that first drink immediately, and we take that, we overcome the obsession, we give into the obsession rather, triggers the allergy, and we're off to the races. And we looked at Bill's story for an example of somebody who recovered from this hopeless state of mind and body. And if we've read Bill's story and we identified with Bill, and I'm sure we all were able to in some way identify with how he thinks and how he drinks and how he acts and how he reacts, then by the end of that chapter, we should all be able to say, if he could do it, I could do it. So what is it that he did? Well, appropriately enough, the next chapter is called There is a Solution, and that's where we are today. We're reading about the solution. Please note the title of the chapter is There is a Solution, not there are several. A solution. I think it's just alcoholics who could read words like precise and specific and then make a statement like, well, there are as many ways to work this as there are people in the program. I don't get that. The book gives us precise, specific instructions for how these people recovered. And they're talking about that, and there is a solution. We're unveiling what we're talking about here, and there is a solution. And where we are in the chapter is we've been introduced to a certain American businessman. His name was Roland Hazard, who we met last chapter in Bill's story. Roland Hazard was one of the three people involved with rescuing Ebby Thatcher from being sentenced to alcoholic insanity at the Brattleboro Lunatic Asylum. And he took Ebby under his wing, brought him to his home to detox, then brought him to the Calvary Mission in Manhattan, where he remained sober, and he called on his friend Bill Wilson, and rest is history. But we're talking about now, we're getting a little deeper into Roland Hazard. He was a part of one of the richest families in America. We're lucky today. After we go through some of the things in the book, I've asked our friend, the historian Patrick O'Donnell, who's here today, to give us a talk, a good 10 minutes or so on Roland Hazard, his not just the background, but some of the myths. And let's destroy some of the myths as well. We'll be talking about some myths as we go through it, and then he can approach those when he talks about it. So we've got this man, Roland Hazard, who's an alcoholic, seeing the best psychiatrists in the United States, and still failed to overcome his malady. So he went to Europe to see the greatest psychiatrist in the world over there, and he wound up with Dr. Jung, Carl Jung. Turns out he was referred to Dr. Jung. There's a story that Joe and Charlie tell that he went over there with the intention of seeing Sigmund Freud, the greatest psychiatrist in the world, but he couldn't because Sigmund Freud was doing research and not seeing patients. So he went on to the number two psychiatrist in the world, Dr. Adler, and Adler couldn't take on the burden of seeing a patient with the regularity and frequency he'd have to for Roland. So he went to number three on his list, Carl Jung. And the significance of that story, the reason why Joe and Charlie told it over and over again, is that Carl Jung was a student of Sigmund Freud. So was Adler, a student of Sigmund Freud. But Dr. Jung had a falling out with his mentor and his contemporary over the point of they believe that every malady can, with sufficient time and probing, be overcome with analysis. Spend enough time on the couch, we can figure out what the problem is and solve it. And Dr. Jung believed no, there are certain problems like alcoholism that need a spiritual solution. And the significance there is if Roland Hazard had not gotten to Dr. Jung, who sent him on this mission to seek a spiritual recovery, which we'll talk about in a moment, if he's wound up with one of the other two guys, we probably wouldn't be here today. It's part of this delicate chain of cosmic coincidences. Andy, you want to put up the history diagram? I think it's 1A. This illustrates what was going on roughly around the same time. The bottom part of the diagram shows Dr. Silkworth in 33, 34, when he dealt with Bill Wilson, and he imparted on Bill Wilson the problem. He defined the problem, the physical allergy, the mental obsession. Roughly the same time in Switzerland, Dr. Jung is treating another alcoholic by the name of Roland Hazard. And Roland Hazard relapses, and we'll read about that in a moment. And when he comes back to Dr. Jung gives him the news that you have to find a spiritual solution. So Roland Hazard eventually gets involved with the Oxford groups, and there's a picture there of Frank Bookman, who was the leader of the Oxford groups. And Roland sobered up through the Oxford groups. And Roland eventually ran into Ebby Thatcher in August of 1934 and helped Ebby get sober. There's a picture of Ebby, a little artistic. Throckmorton is his middle name. We love that. And Ebby brought his solution to Bill Wilson. And for the first time in the history of mankind, the solution and the problem existed side by side in the mind of one person, Bill Wilson. So this diagram just explains this delicate chain of cosmic coincidences that led to Bill Wilson, that led to Bill Wilson running into Dr. Bob, that led to the birth, the wholesale miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous. Any one of these things, this delicate balance, any one of these things didn't happen, we wouldn't be here today. And the one that I'm making reference to is the first one, Dr. Jung treating Roland Hazard. If Roland Hazard wound up with one of these other two people, according to legend, the apocryphal story, we probably wouldn't be here, but he didn't. He went to Dr. Jung. That's who he intended to see in the first place. But I like the story, so I tell both, and you could make your decisions. Okay, let's take that down. And where we are is on page 27. The top of the page, the very first paragraph has an interesting line on it that I've underlined and highlighted, which says some of our alcoholic readers may think they can do without spiritual help. That's implying that alcoholic readers think in the first place. Most alcoholic readers don't think, but he's giving us credit for thinking and thinking that we could do without spiritual help. It's the last thing in the world we need is spiritual help. And Roland Hazard was treated by Dr. Jung, and he relapsed. And when he came back, the doctor said, you have the mind of a chronic alcoholic. I've never seen a single case recover where that state of mind existed. Our friend felt as though the gates of hell had closed on him with a clang. Can you imagine that? Receiving that diagnosis from your physician? You're being diagnosed as hopeless. Have a nice life. How do you go for lunch after that diagnosis? In any case, Our friend felt as though the gates of hell had slammed behind him. He said to the doctor, "Is there no exception?" And that's where we left off last week. "Yes," replied the doctor, "there is. Exceptions to cases such as yours have been occurring since early times. Here and there, once in a while, and please underline and highlight this, alcoholics have had what are called vital spiritual experiences. Let's define our terms. Vital. Once again, vital means life supporting. One of your lungs is not a vital organ. You can live without one of them. Same thing with your kidneys. You could live without one of them. Your heart is a vital organ. You only have one. You can't live without it. And I always say that I lived most of my life as if my brain weren't a vital organ because I didn't use it very much. But technically, the brain is a vital organ. You cannot live without it, contrary to my history. They had vital, life-supporting spiritual experiences. Before we go on, I'm going to put up, where is it, the quote. Number 6, Andy, if you would, please. This is William James, who wrote the book Varieties of Spiritual Experience. This is his take on that term, spiritual experience. Did I not give you the one? Oh, I know what it is. I'm sorry, Andy. It's SE2 from last week. I'm really sorry. SE2 from last week. If you give Andy a second to get that up. This is the William James quote. That was a picture of William James and his book, Varieties of Spiritual Experience. And in that book, he defines what a spiritual experience is. And here's his take on that. He says, what is attained is often an altogether new level of spiritual vitality, a relatively heroic level in which impossible things have become possible, like sobriety. And new energies and endurances are shown. The personality is changed. The man is born anew. Sanctification is the technical name of this result. The effect of conversion is to bring with it a changed attitude towards life, which is fairly constant and permanent, although the feelings fluctuate. In other words, the persons who have passed through conversion, spiritual experience, psychic experience, the persons who have passed through that conversion, having once taken a stand for the religious life, tend to feel themselves identified with it, no matter how much their religious enthusiasm declines. Worldly clamors, life's trials and low spots, life's vicissitudes, those things don't deter us from our spiritual way of life if we rely on them, if we use them. And that's what he's saying. So Dr. Jung, getting back to where we are in the book, in the middle of page 27, he said alcoholics have had these vital spiritual experiences, and that's what he's talking about. To me, these occurrences are phenomena. Phenomena, let's define a term again. Phenomena are observable yet unexplainable facts. Something you could see but cannot explain. It's a phenomenon. Now the quote phenomenon of craving has been revealed. We know metabolically what happens in our body when we drink alcohol with enzymes and coenzymes and acetones and all of this other happy horse shit, which makes my hair hurt just to think about it. The point is, phenomenon doesn't apply anymore because we can explain it. But he's talking now about these spiritual experiences that he cannot explain. They're phenomena. And I'm going to ask that you highlight the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 lines in pink. This section we're going to wind up going back to over and over throughout our journey, all through the next 100 some odd 140 pages. We're going to be referring to this paragraph, what he says here, repeatedly. It's that important. So he's now explaining it. He says these appear to be in the nature of huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. Huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. What's a simple way of saying that? Change. Remember, we went through the spiritual experience appendix, and there were 14 and now probably 16 or 17 references to the word change. So spiritual experience, as we just saw in the definition from William James, is change, conversion. And he's saying these huge emotional displacements and rearrangements. And here's, to me, the most important part of this sentence. Ideas, emotions, and attitudes, which were once the guiding forces of the lives of these men, are suddenly cast aside, and a completely new set of conceptions and motives begin to dominate them. That's all in pink. That's all underlined. And in my book, I have an asterisk starting with the word they appear and ending with dominate them. It's that important. And dominate is another way of saying change. It's amazing how many ways he's come up with to say change. So he's talking here about change, revolutionize, transformation. It's an interesting, if we take the quote, let me go back. He says that here and there, once in a while, alcoholics have had what are called vital spiritual experiences. If you have the study version in the blank page opposite, you may want to write a variation on that, which is in my book, I've written here and now. Alcoholics have had vital spiritual experiences as a result of these steps. So he said here and there, once in a while, they've had it. Well, in Alcoholics Anonymous, we are in the business of wholesale miracles. We make spiritual experiences. That's what we do here. We manufacture spiritual experiences in Alcoholics Anonymous. So that statement would be for us, here and now, alcoholics have had spiritual experiences as a result of these steps. And they call that the wholesale miracle of Alcoholics Anonymous. So continuing with what the book says, he says, in fact, I've been trying to produce some such emotional rearrangements. You may want to underline that. It's another way of saying change within you. With many individuals, the methods which I implied are successful. And let's highlight and underline this one. But I have never been successful with an alcoholic of your description. How do you just leave the doctor's office and go about your day after being told those things? Well, I'm sure Roland didn't really enjoy the diagnosis he was given. Upon hearing this, our friend was somewhat relieved, for he reflected that after all, he was a good church member. This hope, however, was destroyed by the doctors telling him that while his religious convictions, please underline the word religious convictions were very good, in his case, and let's underline, they did not spell the necessary vital spiritual experience. In the book, Bill W., First 40 Years, is a quote on exactly what it is that Dr. Jung did say to Roland. Andy, if you could give me number, I think it's 27.5, Jung's quote. There we go. This is from the book, as it says there, Bill W., My First 40 Years, an autobiography of the co-founder of AA. And for those of you taking notes, Bert, that's on page 125 of that book. And this is what Dr. Jung says. Carl Jung shook his head. No, Roland, that isn't enough. Faith and good works are good, very good. But by themselves, they almost never budge an alcoholic compulsion like yours. I'm talking about the kind of religious experience that reaches into the depths of a man, that changes his whole motivation and outlook, and so transforms, changes his life that the impossible becomes possible. The impossible, sobriety, becomes possible. That's what Dr. Jung said to Roland Hazard when Hazard mentioned that he's active in his church. And I'm going to continue to read from the book on page 126. Dr. Jung said, because Roland asked him, well, how do I do that? Dr. Jung said, that's something I can't tell you. All you can do is place yourself in a religious atmosphere of your own choosing, admit your personal powerlessness to go on living, and if under such circumstances you seek with all your might, you may then find. But the experience you need is only occasional, here and there, now and then. Alcoholics have recovered through them. You can only try. Not a very encouraging diagnosis, but at least he's giving them a flimsy reed to hold on to. So getting back to the book, and again, this is a really good book that we took it from, Bill W. What Bill did is he dictated his story, and somebody transcribed it into a narrative, and that's what this book is. So it's Bill telling his story. That's why they refer to it as an autobiography. In any case, getting back to the book where he says, I've never been successful with an alcoholic of your type. So after a year of treatment, or after an extended period of time, Roland leaves only to get drunk and come back. And upon his return to Dr. Jung, again, one of the world's greatest psychiatrists, he's told there's nothing he could do for him, that he's probably going to die, that he's hopeless. And when he's asked, are there no exceptions, this great mind, this extraordinarily humble individual had the humility to step aside and describe the phenomenon of a spiritual experience. He didn't write a prescription for a Valium deficiency. He didn't say, Roland, I need to see you twice a week now instead of once a week. He didn't do any of that nonsense. He had the humility to say, I can't fix you. There was another doctor who had the humility like that, and that's Dr. Silkworth. Had the humility to say to Bill Wilson that this is what the problem is. I can't fix you with prescriptions, and I can't fix you with treatment. I don't know what the solution is, but I know what the problem is. So we have two great, incredibly humble doctors who are responsible for our first step, Dr. Silkworth, and our second step, Dr. Jung.
I just want to backtrack for a second. I have a message in the chat about Courtney Beeler being Roland's primary therapist in the US and how that shouldn't be overlooked. Do you want to speak a little bit on that?
I'm going to leave that to Patrick.
Oh, okay. There you
Patrick
go.
talk about
cliffhanger.
So hang around. You may want to write that down. Courtney Baylor is the name. Patrick will mention it. But upon hearing this, a friend was I'm sorry. They did not spell the necessary, vital spiritual experience. Top of page 28. Here was the terrible dilemma in which our friend found himself, underlined terrible dilemma. And one of the things that I do when I work one-on-one with people is when we arrive at a point like that, I turn it into a question for them. What was your terrible dilemma? What was the circumstance that brought you to the willingness to do this? We all have something that we can identify in our story as being, that's the moment it happened. And that's what we're talking about here. The terrible dilemma he found himself in when when he had the extraordinary experience, an underlying extraordinary experience, and above it, let's write spiritual experience through the Oxford group, which is we have already told you, made him a free man. I'm gonna hold up right here and turn it over to Patrick, who's going to talk to you about Roland and separate some fact from fiction and tell us about Courtney Baylor. Patrick? Andy, you want to put up picture number 2 while Patrick is talking?
You don't need the picture. That's okay. I think
Okay.
I can understand it. How many? What do you want? 10 minutes or 15 or 12?
10, 15, it's up to you. Go for it.
Okay, let me hit my timer here. My name's Pat. I'm an alcoholic. I'm a member of the Boston Sunday morning group, which meets at Berkeley School of Music. Nice little meeting, about 60 people. And Howard called me this morning and asked me about this. And I think I had done something with Howard on Roland Hazard a couple of years ago. So I always like to fill in the blanks here. And don't get upset. I know it's going to ruin some of your myths, but that's okay, because life is a story, okay? There is no Santa Claus. The Easter Bunny's not coming. And the chances are that Jonah did not get thrown up on the beach by the whale. A parable for being reborn. Anyway, Roland Hazard is from around here, is from New England. His family came into New England in the 1600s. And they started up in Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont, worked their way back down to Rhode Island. They still kept property in Vermont, which I will show you later on. But the family was a very established family. They came down to Rhode Island, and they became key players in the textile industry in the United States, which also meant, and they were in shipping, which meant that they were involved with the slave trade down in the South, in South Carolina. They had mills. They were a big family. They were on the par of the Rockefellers, et cetera, at an earlier time. The Roland's father was the one that really got the thing going in it, and they really, of course, they did very well prior to and then after the Civil War, because they controlled most of the machinery and mill machinery. And if the tentacles of the family go out, they had purchased property in California in the late 1800s, so they were an international family. They were no slouches. And anyway, Roland was born in 1881, and he went to Yale University, graduated in 1903. And while he was at Yale, he had a bunch of friends like George Fowler, Mendel McCormick, Charles Aldrich, etc. They were all classmates of his. And the ironic thing was that by 1910, a number of his friends had already came in contact, because of their own mental health problems, with Carl Jung. This was by 1910. So anyway, Roland had a sort of a notorious career. He went to Yale. The reason he went to Yale was because his mother's uncle was Eli Whitney, who invented the cotton gin, and he was enormously wealthy, and that's why they call Yale, the athletes at Yale are called the Elis, named after Roland Hazard's mother's uncle. Anyway, so he went there, he graduated, came back, went to work for the family business in Rhode Island, which was expanding all over the place, including railroads. I mean, if you need to bring cotton from the South, you might as well own the ships. If you want to go ahead and send finished goods back down to the South, you might as well own the railroads. So that's what they did. And since you got the railroads, you might as well have everything else. And they were into banking, finance, real estate development, including Narragansett, Newport, Rhode Island, et cetera. And Roland was right in there. During World War I, just at the opening of World War I, Roland went into the service, and his younger brother Tom went into the service. Tom, by the way, was a classmate of Sam Shoemaker's in prep school. It's a very, very, very incestuous little community here. Tom went off to war. Roland stayed here in the United States. At the end of the war, the father died, and this will give you this was the Great Gatsby era now we're running into. The father died. The family voted to go ahead and to have young Tom take over the family business and not Roland. So Roland sort of went off on a tear, left the family business, went to New York, was sort of high, wide, and handsome, went to work for a family business and took care of their own family accounts. I mean, these people were, they call it a family office now, but I mean, just managing the family's money was a full-time occupation. And Lee and Higginson put him to work there. So, but his drinking continued. And he ended up in a couple of drying out spots and throughout New England, including McLean Hospital, the Austin Riggs Clinic, etc. And coming back from a trip, he and his wife, Helen, from Bermuda, evidently it was pretty nasty down there, and the family met him in New York when the ship came in, and they decided that there was not going to go ahead and this was 1925, 26, that the Austin Riggs Clinic or McLean Hospital or any other sanatorium wasn't going to do it. So because his cousin Leonard Bacon had already been to see Carl Jung and had good results, had been analyzed with him, and since Roland, a lot of Roland's friends, including Charles Aldrich, were disciples of, they spirited him right off to Europe. He was fast tracked to see Carl Jung. There was no visit to Freud. There was no visit or consideration of Adler. I mean, he was right off to see Carl Jung. And that was supplemented. Carl Jung had a better handle on problems like addiction, et cetera, because he was very familiar with William James, which was just talked about. And William James knew that if you had a vital spiritual experience, you could reach that point of sanctification where you could possibly change your life, providing you stop drinking. He knew that, and he wrote about it. I just finished over my Thanksgiving, New Year's holiday, a tedious reading of the varieties of religious experience. I'm telling you that it's a project, it's a project, it's a project. I've got a fairly good mind and a good education, and it's a tedious thing. So you read it a page at a time almost. Anyway, you can see where they came from, but there was an acknowledgement that it was the grace of God that would go ahead and possibly bring about the change in you. And this was the same thing that Carl Jung realized. He was telling, said, I don't know how to get it to you, but if you go ahead and have this spiritual experience and set the right people and have a change of attitude, you might be able to get sober. So anyway, off they were. They only spent 6 weeks in Zurich. Okay, both he and the wife were there undergoing analysis. There's research and letters back and forth. This isn't a rumor. I mean, there were letters where he stayed, et cetera, back and forth. And they thought that they had the game all together. And he wrote back to his family and he said, I think I got it this time. When they got back to New York in the middle of the summer, he was drunk again. And his wife had had enough, really, at this time. This was 1926. He decided that he needed a geographical cure this time. So he turns around. She starts filing for divorce. He goes off and does a safari in Africa, which turned out very, very bad. He almost died. He was hospitalized in Nairobi. Now, Nairobi in 1927 isn't a place to be hospitalized. I mean, you are really not talking advanced care there. So brother Tom, the poor guy that had to take over the business, the younger brother, the classmate of Sam Shoemaker's, had to go over to Africa, pick up his older brother, and bring him back to London to get him back into shape. Leonard Bacon, the cousin that had been sobered up, and a lot of his friends, they all showed up in London to help him. And what does Roland do? He goes on a drunk again. And he disappointed him so bad that they all went back to wherever they were. The sister-in-law was living in France. Bacon was living someplace in Italy, I think. And they just left him alone. And he came back to the United States. get back to the United States and went on a geographical tour, and this is how they ended up with that, the pottery thing out in New Mexico, etc. And he continued on to California, where he ran into a lot of those same Yale classmates, Charles Aldrich, who was a Jungian therapist at the time, Peter Baines, George Fowler, one of the McCormicks, and they all were advocates of Carl Jung. And I think it was Baines who was had been working for Carl Jung, but got involved with one of the patients, which was ethically not the way to go it. So he had to be banished, and he was sent over there. But he knew about going ahead and counseling people, so he counseled Roland, and Roland got sober again in 1930. And with tail between his legs, he came back to the United States, and he and Helen reconciled. And in 1931, they got remarried in New York City. And it was funny because the only people that were at the wedding were his children, his brother, his aunt, his mother, and his lawyers and her lawyers. I mean, we're talking megabucks on this thing here. And so anyway, they go on a family cruise. They're going to celebrate the reclamation of Roland. Roland's sober now, possibly a year. And they go off, they go to, they're traveling throughout. They send the LaSalle over on a ship. That's how big they were. And he's back there, and he with the whole family. They take a couple of days. They go up to Zurich to go ahead and to tell Carl Jung, look how good I'm doing now. I finally got it. I'm not drinking. Everybody's happy. They come back. They return to the United States. He gets drunk again. He gets drunk again. And the family just goes bananas at this stage here. Helen goes ahead and takes off. She's going to get the money anyway. She probably had a prenup set up by this time here. And but so he's banging around, and what they do is they have no hospitals for him, but they had sent him to Appleton up in at McLean Hospital before, and Appleton in the Emmanuel movement had some luck on helping people get sober, and Courtney Baylor was a lay therapist there. So the Hazard family employed Courtney Baylor in the early 1930s as a family therapist because it was a big family, so they had big problems. It wasn't just alcohol. He was doing family counseling, etc. And they had property still up in Vermont, so he went up to Vermont, and Courtney Baylor gave him some private label conversion up there, and had him periods of time, had him sober. And it finally just didn't work. And even Courtney Baylor had to throw up his hands. Now he said, listen, you need this religious stuff a lot more than I have. You know, Sam Shoemaker, here comes another name. Sam Shoemaker was the head of the Oxford group in the United States, had just taken it over. They knew Sam Shoemaker. Number one, the brother had gone to prep school with him. Number two, Roland's oldest daughter had dropped out of college and had joined the Oxford group and was at Calvary Church in New York City. So he goes down, he meets with Sam Shoemaker over a period of time, and Sam Shoemaker is able to make the connection. Remember, Sam's got the Princeton education, he's got all of the right stuff, and he finally gets Roland to go ahead and consider that he might be having a problem with alcohol. Now, this doesn't happen overnight. They meet, and finally, Roland sort of lets down his guard and says, and surrenders. And Sam says, the only way you're going to get this is to get God. And so Roland just gives up. He gives up, and Sam gives him some private label recovery, takes him under his wing, takes him on some of these Oxford group tours around into Winnipeg and into, I think, Cleveland and possibly Chicago, etc. And he's part of a group of people. So fellowship now is part of his deal. Fellowship is part of his deal. And it's 1934, and he's traveling with Sam Shoemaker and a couple of these other people. They don't all have problems with alcohol, please remember. They have other problems. So they come back to New York City, and he goes on another tour, and he takes a couple of the Oxford group guys, and they go up to Vermont, and that's where one of them has a friend. Eber Graves is one of the friends from the Oxford group in New York. They're up at Roland's house up in Vermont. One of Eber Graves' friends from growing up is going to have to appear in front of the judge the next day. That guy, Ebby Thatcher, was Seaver Graves' friend. They go in, they do a deal in the back room because Roland Hazard's not going to any court to bail for some drunk out. I mean, he's a little bit too fussy for that. But the judge was Seaver Graves' father. So they whisk him out of town. They say, if you can get this guy out of our jurisdiction and bring him back to New York and get him sober, that's good. We'll suspend the charges. They bring Ebby Thatcher back down to New York, the three of them, at least three of them. I think Peter Marshall was in there too. They get him back. They put him into the place at the Cavalry Mission, which is run by Sam Shoemaker. Roland Hazard did not bring Ebby Thatcher into his house. Ebby Thatcher was not the type of person you would bring home to your wife and family, believe me. So there he is. Roland's sober a couple of months now. Ebby's sober only a couple of months. And that's how the whole thing starts. And they go off to see, after a couple of months, really. Ebby Thatcher's only sober a couple of weeks or months. He goes ahead and corrals Bill. Eventually, they bring him back over. Bill gets involved with the Oxford group, and you're off and running. The fact of the matter is, Roland basically kept an arm's length thing. He did not go ahead. He never really got involved with Alcoholics Anonymous. He stayed sober on his own, mostly. He had a couple of slips before then. And then he went off. He got back into business pretty well. He was part of and towards the end, during World War II, he ran a big manufacturing plant in Waterbury, Connecticut, making brass shells, etc., cannon shells, rifle shells, etc., and continued on, kept a low profile. In 1946 or 45, excuse me, two of his sons, Peter and Roland, were both killed in action in the service. It was a death-defying blow for the guy. He died at his desk in 1945. Whether he was drunk or not doesn't make too much difference. He was probably just depressed. A couple of months later, unfortunately, the wife Helen committed suicide. And that said, he didn't have much interaction with Carl Jung afterwards. Carl Jung was even staying with Leonard Bacon in the same neighborhood in Rhode Island. I mean, it was a sort of, but why do you go ahead and have him? Carl Jung, the way to get, I use this thing, I'm sorry that this is not really that well put together, but we all hear in AA these things, these slogans, and it says, continuing to do the same thing over and over again is a definition of insanity according to Einstein. Einstein never said it, okay? And the fact of the matter is, in 1931, there was no great bonding between Carl Jung and Roland Hazard, but Carl Jung liked the idea of a spiritual experience and total abstinence, and it was a way for Bill Wilson to go ahead and get Carl Jung's name into the book. And people would say, if Carl Jung believes it, maybe we should take another look at it too. So that's a discombobulated presentation on Roland Hazard. I got plenty of answers for questions, but I just wasn't prepped for it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Patrick. That was great. Thank you. Andy, would you mind putting up number 10C? Patrick made mention of this. I may as well show it to you. As many of you know, I come from Connecticut, down here to Florida, and I lived next door to Waterbury, Connecticut. And in Waterbury is the Bristol Company factory, still exists. This is a picture of what it looks like now. It's decayed, it's abandoned. Apparently the ground underneath it is so polluted they can't sell it or do anything with it because of its proximity to the Connecticut River. You could see right next to it. But where that little arrow is in the bottom is the building where Roland Hazard had his office. And as Patrick mentioned, he died at his desk of a coronary occlusion, heart blockage, on Thursday, December 20th, 1945. He was 64 years old. He died at that desk.
Yeah, it's quite one of the things from some other stuff that has come back, including a letter from Bill Wilson to one of the people up there in that original gathering up in Vermont. There was really no connection between Roland Hazard and Bill Wilson for the last 10 years of Roland's life, from, let's say, 1935 through. except maybe a handshake at one time in the early 30s. But there was no real connection between the two of them.
Yeah, he never really became part of AA, right? He was always associated with the Oxford group. Is that
Well,
right?
my personal opinion, he was a pretty opinionated guy. He didn't really hang too much with the Oxford group after he liked the world tours, but he didn't like the down and dirty weekly meetings, I don't think, Howard.
All right. Thank you so much, Patrick. That was great. Let's
Howard, you're muted.
okay. Have I been muted this whole time? I'm so sorry. We're on page 28. Thank you, Patrick. I appreciate that. On short notice, I just reached out to Patrick this morning. So thank you so much for being willing to do that. We're on page 28. We had the first paragraph where it says he's had the extraordinary experience, which we've told you made him a free man. We, in turn, and please highlight this, sought the same escape with all the desperation of drowning men. And let's underline desperation of drowning men. Drowning men don't ask questions. They're too busy gasping for air. That's what we need. We need to get to people when they have that desperation. And, you know, it's I think a paradox of modern AA culture is that we want our people to come to us with the desperation of drowning men. And then what do? We sit down, go through the book, and take 4 months to get to how it works. Never going to make it. That window of opportunity is going to slam shut and the obsession will return. So we have to be able to work quickly with those critical newcomers, those people who are literally bleeding out on our floors. We got to work with them fast, the way they worked with them in the beginning. Bill Wilson went through the steps in a matter of hours with Ebby. We could do it in days. So it's just kind of a personal opinion, but we want them with this desperation, yet we expect them to hang in there while we take 6 months to get through the book. Never happened. I wouldn't be here if that's the way I was approached. But okay, we want the desperation of drowning men. And please highlight the rest of this paragraph in pink. It is a promise. What seemed at first a flimsy reed, underline flimsy reed, please, has proved to be the loving and powerful hand of God. A new life has been given us, or if you prefer, a design for living that really works. Flimsy reed. For me, that flimsy reed in the beginning was belief. I'm going to mute everybody because I'm getting some interference here. I'm sorry. The flimsy reed of belief. Hope. Hope is what belief is. When I came in here, that's all I had was hope. And based on that hope, based on that belief, I made a decision to pursue the power that you tell me can do this for me by implementing a plan of action, steps 4 through 11, 4 through 9 in particular, that produces results. And the results are, I no longer believe. I know. I have faith. So we start off with this flimsy reed of belief that turns into the loving and powerful hand of God. In other words, faith. We start with belief, we end with faith. And that happens as a result of work. I always tell people that at the intersection of the road called work and the road called prayer, that's where you'll find God, at the intersection of those two streets. So a flimsy reed of belief has turned into a loving and powerful hand of God, faith, and a new life was given us. and a design for living that really works. That design for living is underlined. And we're talking, of course, about steps. That's our design for living, are the steps. The distinguished American psychologist William James, who we've been talking a lot about today, in his book, Varieties of Religious Experience, one of the few books actually named in this book. And is that conference approved literature? I don't know. I don't care really. This is the book we're talking about, The Varieties of Religious Experience. And as Patrick mentioned, and I'm sure you've heard other people mention here, it is a laborious, difficult read. It is so dense. I've tried and tried and tried, and I'll try again. But for what it's worth, if you'd like, I'm going to pass along something that was given to me as a kind of a hint. My friend Jay Stennett, who read the book and says he understands it, but when he was struggling with it, he said the way he found into the book was he did what Bill Wilson did, which is he started by reading lecture number 9 called Conversion. Jay Stennett is making a video, and he's writing a book about Bill's life from 1955 to 71. And he had access to a lot of Bill's records and in the archives. And somehow he found that when Bill read this book, what he started with was conversion number 9, lecture number 9, conversion. So try that. Next time you go and try and read that. It reads a little bit easier, but it's laborious. It's just so difficult, so dense. But in any case, we're talking about William James in his book, Variety of Religious Experience. He indicates that a multitude of ways in which men have discovered God. And please highlight and underline this sentence. We have no desire to convince anyone that there's only one way by which faith can be acquired. Underline it, highlight it, and I'm going to repeat it. We have no desire to convince anyone that there's only one way by which faith can be acquired. If what we've learned and felt and seen means anything at all, it means that all of us, and please underline those 3 words, all of us, whatever our race, creed, or color, are the children of a living creator. And this is all highlighted till the rest of this sentence, with whom we may form a relationship upon simple and understandable terms. Simple and understandable terms. You may want to underline that. And the simple, understandable terms, they're mine. God as I understand them, my conception of God. It can't be too complex if I thought of it. So if I'm thinking of it, it is simple, and it's something that I can understand. So we form this relationship. We start this relationship on a simple and understandable term as soon as, and that means now, we are willing and honest enough to try. Willing and honest enough to try. And you may want to put a question next to that or opposite that. Am I willing and honest enough to try? And if you think your way is working out well, look at your life. If it resembles those bedevilments on 52, then it's not working out too well. So if we're willing and honest enough to try, and again, the understandable terms we're referring to are mine. Those having religious affiliations will find here nothing disturbing to their belief or ceremonies. There's no friction among us over such matters. We think it of no concern of ours what religious bodies, please underline religious. We talk religion, we talk spirituality. In this case, we're talking religion, that we don't care what your religious backgrounds are, our members identify themselves as individuals. This should be an underline, please, an entirely personal affair, which each one decides for himself in the light of past associations or his present choice. Not all of us join religious bodies, and please underline, but most of us favor such memberships. My people have a tendency of saying, it couldn't hurt, so it couldn't hurt. Give it a try. What's the worst that could happen? In the following chapter, there appears an explanation of alcoholism. That chapter is chapter 3, more about alcoholism. As we understand it, then a chapter addressed to the agnostic, chapter 4, we agnostics. Many who once were in this class are now among our members. We want to define terms here again. Agnostic is made up of two words, ag, which when you add to a word means without. Gnostic comes from, I believe, the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge. So agnostic, broken down, means without knowledge. One who is without knowledge, without experience of God in our life. And I believe we're all, when we get to this chapter, we're going to talk about it, but I believe we're all agnostics. And if you doubt that, look at the area of your life right now that might be a little unmanageable. There's always something going on that we feel like, I got to get a little involved. Maybe I got to get specific with what I'm asking God to do. That's doubt. That's agnosticism. And that's healthy. And there's nothing wrong with that. And I believe we're all agnostic. And if you doubt it, look at your life and what is the area of unmanageability right now in your life? Maybe someone close to you is sick. Maybe you just lost a job or you're starting a new job. Maybe you're ending a relationship. Maybe you've got a diagnosis of an illness, any of these things in our life that we can't fix, but we think we have to get involved with. So, many who once were in this class are among our members. Surprisingly enough, we find such convictions no obstacle to a spiritual experience, so long as we are honest, willing, and honest enough to try. He gave us the condition in the previous page, right? That we can have a simple and understandable relationship as soon as we're willing and honest enough to try. So he's just repeating the same thing here. That we find our convictions, no great obstacle to a spiritual experience. Further on, clear-cut directions. Please highlight and underline clear-cut directions. He's used the words precise. He's used the word specific. And now he's saying clear-cut directions. How people could sometimes take that to mean there are many different ways to do this, I don't know. The book is clear. There's a solution, and we're given precise, specific, clear-cut directions. So further on, we're going to get those directions, the steps. They're given showing how we recovered. You may want to circle the word recovered in orange. It's a recovered reference. But I've got the word showing circled. Very early in the book, I believe it's on page XIII in the foreword to the first edition, Bill says that it's the purpose of this book to show others precisely how we have recovered. Precisely. But the point I'm making is on the word show. At the beginning of the book, he says, we're going to show you how we recovered. We're not going to tell you what to do. We're going to show you what we did. And then here on page 29, he makes reference to clear-cut directions are given in the following pages, showing how we did that. And then if we jump ahead to page 152, we're being told in a vision for you that we have shown how we got out from under. So at the beginning, very beginning, he says, we're going to show you. Here he says, I'm about to show you, pay attention. And then by 152, Bill says, we have shown you. Not told you what to do, shown you how we recovered. These are followed by 43 personal stories. Please highlight the next paragraph, and I've personalized it. And I think this paragraph is so important when it comes time to tell your story. We jump sometimes to page 58 where it says what it was like, how it changed, what it's like now, etc. And I don't think that's the best advice for what to do when you're asked to tell your story. This paragraph gives me much better advice and directions for what do I do when I'm asked to get up in front of a room and share my experience, strength, and hope. Here it is. Each individual, and like I said, I'm going to personalize this. So in my book, it says each individual, in my personal story, describes in my own language and from my own point of view the way I established my relationship with God. There it is. When I get in front of a group of alcoholics and I'm telling you my story, I am telling you from in my own language and from my own point of view, my experience on how I established a relationship with my Creator. I'm going to show you 12 steps in how I did that. I established my relationship by going through the steps. So when I tell my story, I tell my story through the steps, how I developed my relationship with God. These give a fair cross-section of our membership, and please highlight and underline a clear-cut idea of what has actually happened in my life. Not how we stopped drinking. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about how we accessed this power that was able to do for us what we could never do by ourselves. We accessed that power, and we call it God. The book tells us that whenever we see that word, it's your definition. We have to have some understanding about an agreement about terms. So this creator, we're going to call him God. You maybe want to call him Waldo. I like sometimes calling him Waldo. I think the chapter We Agnostics should be retitled as Where's Waldo? As if you're familiar with the book, you know that that's what We Agnostics is about, is finding Waldo. And I don't think God's offended when I say that. No lightning. Okay. We hope no one will consider these self-revealing accounts in bad taste. Our hope is that many men and women, many alcoholic men and women, please underline the word alcoholic and above it, A/O. Just so I'm sure that he's talking about me, not someone else. A/O is allergy and obsession. I know I mentioned it before, but I'll mention it again. Whenever I see that word in this book, real alcoholic, I put A/O above it because I want to be sure he's talking about me. And that our hope is that many alcoholic men and women, and highlight and underline these three words, desperately in need will see these pages, and we believe that it's only by fully disclosing ourselves and our problems that we will be persuaded. Please highlight that word persuaded. Attracted. By telling our story, we're hoping to attract you to ask us the question, how'd you do it? You know, that expression, this is a program of attraction rather than promotion. I'm not so sure. I think it's a program of attraction so we can promote. I attract you, as we just said, by telling our story. And then when you ask me how I did it, I promote, I tell you, show you what I have done. Not promotion like advertising. It's putting forth a way of life. This is the way of life. This is how I access that power. So I am, in a sense, promoting what you asked me about. So, problems will be persuaded to say, and let's highlight, yes, I'm one of them too. I must have this thing. And of course, we circle must in green because there are no musts in the big book. So whenever we come across one, we want to remember that. Yes, I'm one of them too. And after that, I put a question. I put, so how did you do it? By this point in the book, hopefully, through the doctor's opinion, Bill's story, and now there is a solution. We have gotten to the point of curiosity. So how did you do it? Am I willing? Must I have this thing? Or am I still questioning? Do I have the desperation of a drowning man? And we're going to leave it there.